Yeah, I think the biggest problem with performance management and performance metrics of all kinds is they're imperfect, right? They only capture one aspect of performance, and it's possible also to game usually that aspect of performance, that is to do something that works for that metric but maybe hurts the business in some other way, right? And that, by the way, is why one of the reasons we have performance appraisals even in businesses like car selling and trading, because even though you got very clear performance metrics there are ways that people can help the business or hurt them that might enhance their own individual metrics, and you want to be able to capture that. So I think the challenge for human resources in this is to not allow these to become like a fetish, right? So the only thing we look at is this one measure. And balanced scorecard ideas, are nice to be able to measure all that stuff and have them on a dashboard. But I think in the end, there is a human judgment to these things that we can't really ignore. If somebody has done particularly well this year because of challenges that won't show up in the data, that's worth rewarding them. If it turns out that somebody did really well for reasons that had nothing to do with them, a big client just drops in and they're one level down on that, that's not something they should get a big reward for. So we're not at the point, these organizations are not machines, we're not at the point where there is a simple metric that's going to work for the benefit of the organization. So imposing the human judgment and doing that carefully is still the big deal. Well, I think the first thing to recognize is they're in different labor markets, and so you have to respond to what's going on in those labor markets. It's not the case anymore that we really think of employees as being part of a unitary organization. We're all really in this together. We may talk that way, but we know that in many cases, the most important factor is the labor market outside. The IT people care more about being an IT professional than they care about being an employee of your company often. And at the really lowest level, especially if we don't pay very well, people simply hop from job to job to company. So if we're not paying attention to the labor market differences, we're in big trouble. It is probably true that there are some differences in what people need, but it's also possible we can exaggerate that as well, right? So we think often of people at the top end of the spectrum as being motivated by, interesting work and challenge, and people at the bottom as being motivated by money. That's probably unfair, but if you're really poor and you're not being paid much above minimum wage, money is really, really a big deal. And maybe all that's different is people up at the top can afford to care about challenge more because they have enough money that they're not struggling just to pay their bills. So there are differences in terms of the interests of the folks. There are differences in the labor market, but I wouldn't want to exaggerate the differences. Everybody cares about meaningful work. Everybody cares about having a voice in the work that they do. Everybody cares about getting feedback from their supervisors and recognition, and it's important not to forget that. We did an interesting project this last few years. We wrote a book about China, and we interviewed the CEOs of the 75 biggest private companies in China. And one of the things that we heard from them, maybe the most interesting thing, was they were comparing their US and their European competitors. And they said the European competitors were doing better in their view than the US ones were. And the reason was the US, they thought, was trying to run everything way too centrally. And that is, they're trying to run everything out of Detroit or Seattle or wherever the headquarters is with these global policies. Whereas the European companies were adapting more to the China context, right? So I think there's a general question here about how much you want to run everything as a global set of policies out of the U.S. We can certainly make big mistakes there. It may be easier administratively to have one global policy on something, but if it's out of sync with many of the countries you operate in, what have you bought yourself, right? So I think I would, that would be my first concern is how central do you want to be, and to what extent are we really prioritizing convenience administratively at headquarters versus what is actually going to work in the different countries where we operate.